And I just think that this creation of this tearing down of the silos and the walls between the scientific community and the patient community, I think is one of the most important things that I think has happened in our community.
I loved the every person, every pathway. I just thought that was really important to what we were just talking about, that it was really the focus on inclusivity, that they were making sure they were touching on everybody and how they're affected by the disease.
I think for the scientific community, I would say participate, engage, support, because it gives you a window into the life experience of people affected by MS that you don't get in your day-to-day if you're working away either in a mouse room or in a if you're not, particularly if you're not involved in clinical trials or clinical research, you don't see that dimension. But I think it's really powerful. I'm Tim Coetzee. I am the Chief Advocacy Services and Science Officer at the National Multiple Sclerosis Society in the United States.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Higgins, and I am a National Board Director for the National MS Society in the U.S., and I'm living in New Jersey. And I'm also living with MS. I've had MS for 29 years now.
And I'm Brett Drummond. You're listening to the ECTRIMS podcast, the official podcast from the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. At ECTRIMS 2022 in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, a number of new key initiatives, including this podcast, were launched. Importantly, one of the other major changes was the addition of a fourth day to the conference. This extra day was devoted to informing, educating, engaging, and discussing the main research highlights from the meeting to the people that matter the most, people living with MS and other neurological conditions. My two guests today, Tim and Bonnie, were involved in the second iteration of this event, held at MSMilan 2023, and we're going to be chatting today about their experiences, their roles, and why they believe it is important that we continue to put people living with MS and other neurological conditions at the centre of everything that we do. Tim and Bonnie, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
So I guess to start, can you explain the purpose of the Patient Community Day and why you think it's really important that we hold an event like this?
I think the importance of the Patient Day and ECTRIMS edition of the Patient Day is really as an indicator to me of where we are in the MS community today. The ECTRIMS Congress is remarkable because it brings, I think this year was 10,000 plus researchers together to focus on all of the progress that's been made in MS. But one of the actually, I think, critical elements of it is that, the people who are really the true experts in MS are people living with the disease. And the opportunity for the people who are living with the disease to be right at the forefront there of hearing both the advances, but also hearing from other people affected by MS about those advances and what they mean, really is an important leadership signal by ECTRIMS that, solving MS is a partnership between the scientists who are experts in doing science and clinical research, but the people who are experts in living with MS, and that is patients.
Yeah, and Tim, I was really honored when I got the phone call from Tim asking me to come to Milan, and it was my first ECTRIMS experience, and thrilled to be able to offer the patient voice at the Community Day. The day is really designed for individuals living with MS and other related neurological diseases, and it gives patients and their caregivers an opportunity to talk to the researchers and to hear about all the advances and what the discussions were during that week. So it lets them dip in and find out this information. So really exciting time and exciting for us to be a part of that.
I think it's important, sort of touched upon there, that these conversations are two-way. This very much isn't just a day where researchers are talking to the MS community and to the community of people living with other neurological disorders. It's also about, as you say, Tim, listening to people who have that lived experience and learning from that to help shape research directions and really the goals for the next 12 months leading up to the next meeting.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think that's such the critical part about the Patient Day, and why I think, for example, it was such a important step by ECTRIMS, which is really the premier scientific organization in MS globally. It's the largest, and I think brings so many people together to use their leadership position to really advance the relationship between the patient community and the experts is really so important.
Bonnie, you mentioned that you gave a presentation on the patient day at MSMilan 2023, which was a fantastic presentation. I was lucky enough to be in the room to hear it. Can you tell us a little bit about your role during that meeting and some of the things that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked about the pathways to cures. Obviously, it's something I'm very close to, being a director on the national board in the US. And I think it's important that everyone living with MS knows what the Pathways to Cures roadmap is, because they're all on that roadmap and they need to understand what it is, and that everybody is working so hard to touch on each of the pathways. Not just one part of the pathways is important. Each of those pathways is being worked on. So it's really educating them on the pathways and saying that this past week, researchers were talking about each of the pathways and the advancements being made in those pathways. So I reviewed the roadmap and talked about what it meant within the pathways and what it meant to me as someone living with MS, and how we can impact that, how we can impact it by doing advocacy, how we can impact it by raising revenue, so that this research can happen.
And I think it was a really interesting talk, and obviously a really important one. And I wonder if maybe you could both talk a little bit more about the Pathways to Cures initiative, and obviously bringing in your different perspectives of it, Bonnie, as a person living with MS, and how what it means to you, and also Tim, in your role, your thoughts on it.
Sure. Bonnie, do you want to take this and then I can talk a little bit?
Sure. Well, the three pathways, stop, restore, and end, I think, those are three words. Simply, we want the three words to resonate with everybody living with MS. Stopping MS in its tracks is to make sure that no one new gets MS. And what we can do to, stop it early in the early states. Restoring, making sure that any damage that is done can be restored, can be repaired, and obviously ending MS forever. So I'll let Tim, as one of the architects of the pathways, get into the nerdy scientific parts of it. Sorry, Tim.
No, it's all good.
That's a self-proclaimed title. But I think it's important, again, the beautiful thing about the roadmap is it's three words. It's something very simple and something where we can plug ourselves in as patients into one of those pathways. But I think, again, going out and talking to individuals living with MS, going out and talking to caregivers, they understand that and they can feel a part of it and an ownership of it.
And what I can do, I can build on what Bonnie has shared. If I back up a little bit for the context for the audience, the roadmap or the Pathways to Cures, really began when the National MS Society in the United States reimagined our mission statement to say that our mission is to cure MS while empowering people affected by MS to live their best lives. And up until our adoption of that mission statement about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago now, we had sort of broadly talked about cures, but we'd never actually put the word cure into our mission statement, in part because there's this kind of caution around, you put yourself out there to say, we're going to cure this disease. That's taking on a big, bold statement, and can you deliver? And we declared that, in today's day, we have to be that declarative and we have to have that level of ambition. But in declaring that ambition to cure MS, we also saw the need that it just can't be words, as Bonnie said. There has to be a blueprint. And that's where the Pathways to Cures roadmap came, where it was really a blueprint by which we would identify the areas of work in those three stop, restore, and end categories that Bonnie referred to. And then in each of them, we have specific milestones and deliverables we want to achieve so that we can advance scientific progress together. And so all of that was developed and published into a paper in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal last year, actually. And after receiving endorsements by, I think now we're up to 26 different organizations, groups, including ECTRIMS, endorse this vision that, we collectively move together. And one thing just to note around that, why it was important to us to have this be a collective and global effort, is that, we believe that curing MS doesn't belong to any one organization. It doesn't belong to the National MS Society in the United States. It doesn't belong to ECTRIMS alone. It doesn't belong to MS Australia or ACTRIMS, the US counterpart to ECTRIMS. It belongs to all of us, actually. And this is why we felt that we needed to, have a statement, but also have a statement that everyone builds and works on together. And so we're very proud of the roadmap. It's also not a static document. We see it as a living document. We're actually already working on updates and refinements to it because the scientific process, as we learned at ECTRIMS in Milan, keeps moving forward. And we have to continue to adapt and keep moving forward rather than just, viewing this as a static sort of one time and move on to the next thing kind of agenda.
Well, I think it works really well and really perfectly. And Bonnie, you say, it's three simple words, but when you're sitting in the conference and sitting at an MSMilan, it's quite nice to think about it in terms of those three words and thinking about how each presentation that we hear in each development, we can almost categorize into one of those three areas. And it gives a nice way for the MS community to think about what's going on. As a person living with MS who was there and at Community Day and sitting through all this, how did you feel about the progress that was discussed at the meeting around those different areas?
And I want to just add on to what Tim said, that the pathway belongs to all of us, and it belongs to everybody living with MS. And just as this is such a collaborative effort, that the research, it doesn't matter who finds the cure, who finds the fix for restore, who finds the fix for stop, who finds the fix for end. It doesn't matter where that happens because it's a collaborative effort. So it's no longer, my research. It needs to happen. And I think the beauty of when we had the global summit, the first global summit in New York in May, was everybody really was behind that we're all going to work together. And it's really beautiful, the collaboration that's happening across organizations to make this happen.
Yeah, and I think that collaborative nature shows out, at those meetings and again at Congress, both in terms of the scientific meeting and having people researchers coming from all over the world. Also on the patient day, where obviously we had the live event in person in Milan, but also had people logging in from around the world to join us virtually. There is very much a sense of everyone, coming together for the one cause, which is to improve the lives of people living with MS.
If I could build on your comment there, Brett, I think that's one of the aspects of having been sort of in the MS community now for a couple decades myself, sort of this sense of the global connectedness by the scientific community, but also by the patient community. I think this is something that is rapidly accelerating and scaling in a sense that I think it would be hard for us to have appreciated 5 years ago. But what ECTRIMS is doing through the Patient Day is really, I think really building and deepening that network where people with MS in every part of the world can connect in now and get the very latest, which would have been nigh unto impossible just even 10 years ago. And now you have individuals, it's just at the MANACTRIMS conference in the United Arab Emirates, and people there have connected, and you're seeing just this web of interconnection. And that's what makes the difference for patients, because people with MS in many parts of the world can't travel to Milan. This takes the power of Milan to them, which I think is what we as leaders in MS organizations need to be prepared to do every day.
And actually interested in this from both of your points of view as well, do you feel that this is definitely something that's come about being responsive to really the voices of the MS community for a long time saying we want to be included in these discussions. We want to be part of what's going on in the research field. Bonnie, I guess, as a person living with MS, do you see this as a sign of organisations and big groups around the world really starting to listen to that? And I guess, Tim, in your role, obviously continuing through the National MS Society and in roles around these conferences, do you see this as well as being something that's been really pushed hard by the MS community to get more and more involvement in what is happening in a research space?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it has been a change, and it has evolved over the past five years, maybe even a little bit more. But I look at the panel that I was on Community Day, and it was first of all, it was four women. I was so proud to be on that panel of four very powerful women. I'm proud that I'm putting myself in that group, but two other women living with a neurological disease, one other woman with MS, the other woman with, and Tim has to help me with the full word. She didn't have MOGAD, but she had the NMOSD. Suad from France, and then Frederica from Italy, and then Paulo, our research director from Italy. And they were just wonderful. But just being with those other two people with neurological diseases, speaking from the patient's standpoint, it just goes to show that, yes, the patient voice is so important. And we were out talking to the audience afterwards, and those connections are so important. And that those changes you see evolving. And in the U.S., I also was very honored to be part of the
Community Review of Research, which we have within the U.S. organization,
where the people living with MS or their family lives with MS, reviewing research grants from the community perspective, which again you use it, you have that lens on the research grants. The grants are already reviewed by the Scientific Advisory Committee, but then it does a second look with that lens. And so that's great to know that voice is important and considered. And so, Brett, you're absolutely right. I think that is being weighed much more heavily, which from the patient perspective, that just feels really good.
And what I'd add, Brett, is that I think this evolution where ECTRIMS, and I would say it's more than evolution, it's leadership by ECTRIMS to declare that the people affected by MS are part of our journey together to find a cure for MS, and that as the largest scientific organization for MS, they really are in a tremendous position to set an example for the rest of the professional organizations working in MS globally around what it means to engage people affected by the disease in the work, what it means to bring the science and the excitement to them rather than saying to them, come to us, but rather we're going to bring it to you. And I think this is just an incredibly positive development for the MS community in general. I'm a long time ago, I did MS research myself before I came to the society. And I would say when I started as a fellow, this in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the idea that people affected by the disease would be brought into scientific meetings to have a co-ownership role was just, people couldn't even conceive of it. It was sort of like this, we're over here and we'll let people with MS know when we've made progress, when we're ready to share it. And I just think that this tearing down of the silos and the walls between the scientific community and the patient community, I think is one of the most important things that I think has happened in our community. Obviously, there's tremendous amount of science and all of that, just incredible progress. But I think the demonstration that finding a cure is actually a joint effort and not two sort of separate groups working is so important. I think I applaud ECTRIMS for taking a step forward and bringing this to their community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, similarly, on a similar path, I obviously had a former life working in MS research as well, and I think in the more than a decade that I was working on that, I might have had one opportunity to talk to people living with MS about my work. So now the fact that we're doing this on an annual basis, as well as all of the activities that happen outside of the conference time as well, I think is fantastic. So taking that discussion and taking how important it is, one of the things I think would be worth touching on for people who may not have been able to tune into the event or be there in person. Interested from both your perspectives in terms of a couple of the key highlights from the meeting that you think would be particularly of interest to the MS community.
I've got lots of highlights, but I'm as Bonnie has said, I can nerd out. But maybe Bonnie wants to share a highlight, and then I can follow up.
I couldn't be there for the majority of the week. I unfortunately was doing some other traveling, but I'll give you a few of the key highlights that I got from talking to people in a couple of sessions I dipped into when I was there. But first of all, the theme of the whole week, I loved the every person, every pathway. I just thought that was really important to what we were just talking about, that it was really the focus on inclusivity, that they were making sure they were touching on everybody and how they're affected by the disease. So I thought that was really important. The other thing, and Tim had given me a little like sneak preview in this when I was going through the different programs through the week and highlighting which ones I wanted to go to. He talked to me about the aging in MS, and that was going to be one of the hot topics. And indeed, it was one of the hot topics. And a lot of people I talked to when I was there, as well as after I was there, some of the people I didn't even know were there, not surprisingly, knowing the number of people that were there, but how important that is, and the focus on it, just the transition from childhood to when you're a senior with MS, and how you can't treat the disease the same, and maybe you shouldn't be on the same DMT from when you're diagnosed to when you're aging, and how they're really looking at that. I think that's important, and people should know that. And, Epstein-Barr, of course, continues to be a hot topic, and what's happening with that. So those were some of the key takeaways and rapid notes I was taking for when I was there. But Tim, of course, I can sit and have coffee with him for hours and listen to him talk about what's interesting. So we'll pass it on to him.
Thank you. So maybe just at a broad level, I can also say what excited me is I went to Amsterdam, obviously, last year. That was the first sort of post-COVID in person, and you felt sort of the energy. I would say, having been to a number of the ECTRIMS congresses pre-COVID, I would say this is, you really felt the energy, the enthusiasm, that the post-COVID haze is off, and that we're really back to being able to really engage people. And what I loved was walking around the posters and seeing all the energy, the enthusiasm, the number of young investigators who were there. All in all, I thought it was, this is the ECTRIMS Congress that I knew for all those years. As Bonnie said, there are lots of sessions throughout the day, throughout the week, that I was excited. But the concept, the aging work, is really, I think that is so important. And the lens with which I look, sort of the progress we're making in aging in MS is to imagine, we actually never talked about this topic of like, what will it mean to manage MS in people who are 60, 70, 80 years old? When I came into the MS community, we didn't talk about, MS at that part of the continuum, because, there was a lot of quote unknowns about, living a quote full life with MS. Well, now we are talking about that, and it's an important problem actually to sort of figure out, because, the immune system of a 70-year-old is fundamentally different from a 35-year-old. And so I think the fact that the scientific community is engaging in that they're engaging in the challenge of what does it mean to diagnose people that are older. More and more older people are being diagnosed with MS in their 50s and 60s. Well, that's a whole different diagnostic process in a sense, because an older brain sometimes can be, you can see stuff in the brain when a person is older because they're older, or it could be because they have MS and they're older. And so teasing all of that out is super important. And part of that, what excited me were some of the conversations around advanced imaging techniques, the application of artificial intelligence very early to this. I was excited again by some of the EVB studies that came out from this. I was particularly excited by some of the work that was presented around one of the BTK inhibitors that there's a lot of excitement around, and the fact that this BTK inhibitor could perhaps modulate the immune system in the bloodstream as we're used to it doing, but also that it got into the brain and into the spinal fluid at levels of the drug that seemed to be actionable, which again, I think was super exciting. And then there's obviously the continued work around the genetics of progression and the fact that we're getting better and better understanding about this sort of that there could be genetic indicators of a more severe progressive disease, which fits in beautifully with our STOP pathway in the Pathway Secures roadmap. So, I think if your audience hasn't tuned in and watched some of the content that's available live and on stream, I would encourage them to do so, because, I think stepping back, the amount of progress that we've been able to accelerate, coming through the pandemic is just very inspiring. And again, is why I think these patient days are so important, because I think it helps inspire the community to know that there are, at least as I recall, there were like close to 10,000 people in Milan, all sort of pulling in the same direction, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the interesting things, and was sort of a theme on Patient Day, and goes back to, trying to put individuals living with MS and other neurological conditions at the forefront of what we're doing, relating to the aging research and talking about how we need to be very conscious of this, is trying to have a shift towards a more personalized approach to how we treat people living with MS as well, that we can't just bucket everyone together as a person living with MS, that we need to be very mindful of, lots of socioeconomic factors. Obviously, we talk a lot about sex and gender, but there's now this real feeling of how do we treat a person on an individual level. And I think that came through, and I think it came through at the Patient Day as well as being a real focus. So thinking ahead now to Copenhagen in 2024, what topics are you particularly interested in hearing about? Is there anything that sort of come out of this meeting that might have been in early stages that you're really looking forward to updates of at the next meeting?
I think aging part 2. I think also, and it's kind of part of aging part 2, not to be funny, but the cognitive part can focus, because we're learning a lot about cognitive effects on MS and the progress that's being made on cognitive for capability, or cognitive for MS, what they can do for that. And then just really the STOP pathway, I think, is very interesting on what we can do within the STOP pathway. And then, of course, the third community day.
I'm looking forward to all of that. Obviously, getting back together again in Copenhagen will be great, and to see what progress has been made again in the areas that Bonnie has alluded to. I'm interested and looking forward to hearing the updates, although I think, we've heard some not so great news about one of the more recent drug treatments that didn't meet its endpoint. I think I'm looking forward to perhaps there being a presentation from those studies to sort of understand what does this tell us about the BTK inhibitor class, and what does that mean for the future, given the enthusiasm around that. I'm interested in, will there be additional updates around the genetic indicators of MS, and can we understand this whole notion of disease severity around that? And then also, we're seeing so much progress around, the use of imaging to understand the disease better. Things like the central vein sign, paramagnetic rim lesions, and all of those tools, which for the first time are really getting at the pathology of what's going on in MS. So beyond just sort of, okay, you have a lesion, but actually being able to tell us these are lesions that have active immune damage going on. And, can we then begin to use those imaging tools to both intervene and do clinical trials better, smarter, faster? I think those are all things that I'm looking forward to seeing in Copenhagen. in addition to what might be surprising on the horizon. That's one of the things I've learned in a career in science is you don't know what is sort of, lurking out there that could really, transform your thinking about MS. And I think that, there's so much momentum and science in progress that I'm hopeful that we'll continue to have some of those breakthroughs. Maybe we'll have some breakthroughs in pediatric MS and what's happening in pediatric MS, and maybe we'll, I think, make more breakthroughs in terms of what I think is what I consider to be the next frontier, which is understanding the disease mechanisms involved in progression. I mean, we're getting really good at controlling the immune system in terms of how it affects relapses and things like that, but we're still got a long way to go in understanding the biology of progression and the disease pathways in progression. And I'm hoping that come Copenhagen, we'll have made more progress in those areas.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, lots and lots to look forward to. As you said, things to look forward to that we probably don't even know are going to happen yet. Now, I could talk to the two of you for hours about this, but in the interest of time and wrapping things up, one last question that I'd sort of like to finish on is we will have the third iteration of Patient Day, as you said, Bonnie, in Copenhagen, as a message to people who may not have attended either of the first two, maybe Bonnie in terms of people, the lived experience, people living with MS and other neurological conditions. What would you say to them around what benefits they may get out of attending the next one? And I guess, Tim, as well, the benefits to researchers, clinicians, and other people in the MS space, benefits for them around attending the event. I'd love to hear that as sort of a final note.
I think the number one benefit is you just are more empowered. And I think, it's one of the goals of the MS Society is to empower people and empower patients because you become your own advocate. If you walk away with information that you can do something about your own disease. And so attending these things, whether in person or virtually, that's a beautiful thing that you can even go online afterwards and watch these presentations. You learn this information, and then you can go to your neurologist, you can go to your governments for advocacy, and you have this information in hand, and you can ask the right questions. So I think that's probably the most powerful thing. So I recommend it to everybody, and there's no downfall to it.
And I guess to build on what Bonnie said, I think for the scientific community, I would say participate, engage, support, because it gives you a window into the life experience of people affected by MS that you don't get in your day-to-day if you're working away either in a mouse room or in a if you're not, particularly if you're not involved in clinical trials or clinical research, you don't see that dimension. But I think it's really powerful to see that, and I think part of it too is it gives you just a shared appreciation for how the global challenge of solving MS, whether it's relapsing MS, progressive MS, pediatric MS, is a global challenge that needs all of us. And that I think we each have a role to play in this continuum, and that we're all experts from our particular frame of reference, whether we're a research expert, a clinical expert, a patient expert, but that all of it works together to get the cure.
Thank you, Tim and Bonnie, for sharing your time with us today and talking about this really important day that I think we all feel really passionately about.
Thank you. It's been great to be with you. Look forward to seeing you in Copenhagen.
And thanks everyone for listening. Once again, I'm Brett Drummond, host of this podcast episode. I'm also co-founder of MS Translate, an independent resource centre that aims to simplify the complex wealth of information about MS for the greater MS community. The ECTRIMS podcast is produced and hosted in collaboration with two key partners, MS Translate and the MS Journal, a peer-reviewed international journal that focuses on MS, neuromyelitis optica, and other related autoimmune diseases of the central nervous system. The ECTRIMS podcast is supported by an educational grant from Novartis, Roche, and Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. Educational grant providers have no input on the podcast series content. You can read more about the topic of this latest podcast episode and more on the ECTRIMS website, ectrims.eu. Do subscribe to the ECTRIMS podcast on your favourite podcast channels and follow ECTRIMS on X, formerly Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube.